Alright, today I am making a video for Dominion 6, Rise of the Pantokrator, and the purpose of this video is to demonstrate basic combat magic in a test scenario that could be applied to a real game and kind of show how you might use mages to kill an opposing army. A lot of the times when we have newer players being introduced to the game, they don't really understand how they might use their mages in a fight to get value out of them. They'll undermake mages, they won't get the research that they need, and a lot of that does come with experience, so I figured to get a head start on that, we will showcase how to use mages to win a fight here. In addition, this is also going to serve as sort of a mini tutorial for a particular type of Turbocommunion, which is called a healing touch or a healing based Turbocommunion. All Turbocommunions, what they do is they will use healing to restore hit points after fatigue grows high enough to reduce them in a communion slave. So as the battle goes on, we will show that off as it happens. In this case, it was meant to be positioned so that there would be 3 per tile, but we now have these helpful terrain features called a small shrub, which ruins this and can affect your scripting. So thank you, Illwinter, for that one. That actually does matter sometimes, so it is actually a non-trivial new feature of the game. In Dominion 6 it was not present in Dominions 5. In this case, because I know that the enemy I'm fighting is rather slow, I went ahead and forward positioned my troops, or my mages I should say. And we have our combat mages up here. And pretty much the key for using combat mages effectively is to understand what spells you want to cast. So in this particular fight, I have my troops in the back, so that when we meet in combat, it's going to be relatively close as both sides walk forward to my mages so that they can get useful spells off. Now, the enemy side does also have combat mages in this case, and these guys are going to be here to mostly just buff these troops with some standard defensive spells that Ulm would use. In this case, they'll be doing Earth Power and then Temper Armor and Gift of Giant Strength, I believe, which will give the Ulmites more damage and more protection, and which would let them easily win this combat against these troops that I have back here in a normal fight, if I was not also using combat magic. So, why do we use a communion? We use a communion because the spell that I'm going to be cast, which is called Breath of the Dragon, actually scales a little bit. And that scaling means that the higher level the mage casting it, the more effective it is. It's also not possible for these mages to cast it without being in a communion or having some sort of a path boost, because it's a Nature 2 spell, and these are Nature 1 mages. We can see that we have 4 slaves, and so that's giving us +2 effective magic paths, meaning that they're at Nature 3. And here they are casting Breath of the Dragon. It will hit squares and inflict a poison on anybody standing in that square. In this case, when we look at the combat log, we can see that this poor archer has been hit by, if we do some quick math, looks like 42 points of poison damage, so he will die pretty quick. And this militia in front of him has now been afflicted by a similar amount of poison and will also die quickly. In the meantime, in the back here, we can see that our communion slaves are taking a lot of fatigue, and they will soon shoot up to 200 fatigue. And once your mage is at 200 fatigue, they will take a point of damage for every time that fatigue is added on top of that, from a spell cast in this case, plus an additional point every 50 fatigue, I believe. So if you have a lot of big spells going on to relatively few communion slaves, the amount of damage that they will take in hit points goes up rather rapidly. In this case, we are enlarging them so that they go from 13 to 16 hit points, which just gives us a little bit more buffer room in order to work with healing them so that they don't die. Right, and then because the spells that we're casting are relatively low in fatigue, they're being split between 4 Communion Mages. We're casting them as Nature 3s, so it's a Nature 2 spell, which means it will be halved in fatigue anyway. This, also with only having 8 Masters, means that we pretty much have enough buffer room that these slaves should only take about 1 hit point of damage per combat mage in a round once they hit 200 fatigue. And that is enough that our Communion Masters can keep them safe. And we can see over here that our poison spells are going in, and they are doing very well in coating the enemy in poison. Breath of the Dragon is an excellent spell for Tis, not only because they have pretty much perfect nature astral mages to communion up for it, but also because, as we can see, all of my units have poison resistance built in, which makes me take much less damage from this spell, even though I can still take some, compared to what the Olm will be taking here. And as we can see, pretty much all of these Olmites have poison on them, and they are going to start dying very rapidly. So much so that even though they're in melee and clearly doing well against my troops here, they're still going to die before they can kill them all. Right, and this pretty much just goes to show that, yeah, you can use mages to do some sort of offensive action in combat and win a fight with it. Now, some purists among us might say something like, oh, if I had put Body Ethereal using these mages on all of these guys, I still would have won, and I might have, but it's also true that Olm can bring magic damage in the form of things like Guardians, and they would not care about Body Ethereal. Now, if I had this many Guardians fighting me, I could quite possibly still lose, but the point remains that this spell still has some uses that a spell like Body Ethereal that's just buffing my troops does not have. And as we can see, if we look at the combat results here, my melee troops only got 17 kills, and yet we had about 94 to 95 kills on the enemy side, which means that my mages got between 85 and 90 kills, or I'm sorry, between, if I can do math, between 75 and 80 kills, which is pretty good for this kind of combat. Now, we will also, why do you use a Communion? Well, the other reason you might use one is because, as we can see, I'm not spending any gems, right, in order to cast these higher level spells. A spell that it will tell me I cannot actually cast, by the way, as we can see, because it's Nature 2 and this is only a Nature 1. And I could have this exact same fight next turn, because all of my mages are still alive, and even though I have many afflictions on these mages, right, the blind, demented, mute, lizard over here, poor guy, he can still act as a communion slave in combat. So even though these are heavily afflicted, and yes, as you get afflictions, you can start to become, it can be harder to use them as communion slaves. For example, if they have a never healing wound, this will reduce their total hit points and make it harder to keep them safe in a communion. And there are other potential weaknesses with this setup. Obviously, I am forward positioning my mages, so a few fast units in the front would pretty severely hamper me here. And there are countermeasures you can take to that. Similarly, if some archers shot and killed one of my communion slaves, it could unbalance the whole communion, make my mages less effective, increase the fatigue the other slaves are taking. They could also then die because it's being split between fewer people and they're getting more fatigue in an instance. So the balance gets disrupted there. So there are some weaknesses to having this kind of a Turbo Communion setup, but it does go to show you that you can run a Turbo Communion without having a giant with innate regen on it, and it can be effective. Now, you can also scale this up and use 8 Communion Slaves and a few more people doing Healing Touch, and then have a few more Masters, and each of them will also be higher level. And then I could also be casting things like Power of the Spheres, or I could be giving them Thistle Maces. And because the spell that we are using here, if we go and look at it, is Breath of the Dragon, which scales with range, area of effect, and damage, all by level over 2, that basically means that the more powerful my communion, the more powerful the spell is. This is not the only spell with this effect. It is probably one of the better ones, but Ephemeral Blast at the same research level has very similar scalings. It's a very similar spell, in fact. And then also a spell like Shadow Blast is also similar. Shadow Blast has the unique disadvantage of being a gem cost spell, which makes it worse than pretty much any other similar evocation at the level, because you have to invest gems just in order to cast it. If Illwinter removed that, it would be a perfectly fine spell that people would actually cast in the game. But they won't. You do need to know which spells to cast. For example, Water Strike only has an area of effect of 1. This is an underwater spell. I should probably not use that one as an example. Geyser is a very low damage spell. You might still use it in combat, but it also takes a crosspath, so this is not a very useful spell in a Communion. Something like Flare only has an area of effect of 1, so you could still use it in a Communion, but again, it doesn't really have a good scaling. It could still be useful though, especially with the cloud. Fireball also does not scale with area of effect, but because it has a decent area of effect secondary, you could still use this in a Communion as well. It's also a little bit easier to cast, and the damage does scale alright, so you could use it. The really strong elemental spells are things more like Falling Fires, which will scale in area of effect, or something like Falling Frost, which will scale in both damage and area of effect. And there are other options that you could use as well. Orb Lightning doesn't scale, so it's not that good, but the ability to spam that spell out is still rather nice. And a spell like Poison Cloud, which does scale, would be very useful, except that you don't ever... I don't think there's a single... Well, there are probably a couple of mages in the game that could cast this in the Communion, and not reliably at that. So anyway, this is kind of going through. We can see that most of these types of spells end up being an evocation, but there are still other spells which you might Communion up to cast, and that you could use in a Turbocommunion, such as Soul Slay. If you were dealing with relatively few, relatively elite enemies, Soul Slay will kill them in one shot, which makes it quite useful in that particular setup. Or if you were feeling very interesting, you might do Communion up for a Maws of the Earth, which, just like Shadow Blast, takes a gem, but unlike Shadow Blast, it's not a projectile, so it's actually a good spell. And as we can see, the range, area of effect, and damage all scale with level. So if you get a lot of high-level Earth Mages and put a gem on them, you can cripple an enemy in the first round of combat from pretty far away using the Communion. Anyway, this has been a demonstration of how to use mages in combat, and I hope it has been helpful for showcasing the general setup that you might use for a Turbocommunion, and also for how you might use combat magic, specifically aggressive combat magic, in order to get some use out of your mages.